Hello, my darlings. Madam Raven here. Today I'm bringing you The Old Nurse's Story by George MacDonald. I set out one evening for the cottage of my old nurse to bid her goodbye for many months, probably years. I was to leave the next day for Edinburgh on my way to London, hence I had to repair by coach to my new abode. Almost to me like the land beyond the grave, so little did I know about it, and so wide was the separation between it and my home. The evening was sultry when I began my walk, and before I arrived at the end, the clouds rising from all quarters of the horizon, and especially gathering around the peaks of the mountains, betokened the near approach of a thunderstorm. This was a great delight to me. Gladly would I have taken my leave of home with the memory of a last night of a tumultuous magnificence, followed probably by the day of weeping rain, well suited to the mood of my own heart in bidding farewell to the best of parents and the dearest of homes. Besides, in common with most Scotsmen who are young and hearty enough to be unable to realize the existence of coughs and rheumatic fevers, it was a positively pleasure to me to be out in rain, hail, or snow. I am come to bid you goodbye, Margaret, and to hear the story which you promised to tell me before I left home. I go tomorrow. Do you go so soon, my darling? Well, it's an awful night to be telling it, but as I promised, I suppose I must. At that moment, 2 or 3 great drops of rain, the first of the storm, fell down the wide chimney, exploding in the clear turf fire. Yes, indeed you must, I replied. After a short pause she commenced. Of course she spoke in Gaelic, and I translate from my recollection of the Gaelic, but rather from the impression left upon my mind than from any recollection of words. She drew her chair near the fire, which we had reason to fear would soon be put out by the falling rain, and began. How old the story is, I do not know. It has come down through many generations. My grandmother told it to me as I am telling it to you, and her mother and my mother sat beside, never interrupting, but nodding their heads at every turn. Almost it ought to begin like the fairy tales, once upon a time. It took place so long ago, but it is too dreadful and too true to tell like a fairy tale. There were 2 brothers, sons of the chief of our clan, but as different in appearance and disposition as 2 men could be. The elder was fair-haired and strong, much given to hunting and fishing, fighting too upon occasion, I dare say, when they made a foray upon the Saxon to get back the mouthful of their own. But he was gentleness himself to everyone about him, and the very soul of honour in all his doings. The younger was very dark in complexion, and tall and slender compared to his brother. He was very fond of book learning, which, they say, was an uncommon taste in those times. He did not care for any sports or bodily exercises but one, and that too was unusual in his parts. It was horsemanship. He was a fierce rider, and as much at home in the saddle as in his study chair. You may think that, so long ago, there was not much fit room for riding hereabouts, but, fit or not, he rode. From his reading and riding, the neighbours looked doubtfully upon him, and whispered about the black arts. He usually bestrode a great, powerful black horse, without a white hair on him, and people said it was either the devil himself or a demon horse from the devil's own stud. What favoured this notion was that in or out of the stable, the brute would let no other than his master go near him. Indeed, no one would venture, after he had killed 2 men and grievously maimed a 3rd, tearing him with his teeth and hooves like a wild beast. But to his master he was obedient as a hound, and would even tremble in his presence sometimes. The youth's temper corresponded to his habits. He was both gloomy and passionate, prone to anger. He had never been known to forgive. Debarred from anything on which he had set his heart, he would have gone mad with longing if he had not gone mad with rage. His soul was like the night around us now, dark and sultry and silent, but lighted up with the red leaven of wrath, and torn by the bellowings of thunder and passion. He must have had his will. Hell might have his soul. Imagine then the rage and malice in his heart when he suddenly became aware that an orphan girl, distantly related to them, who had lived with them for nearly 2 years, and whom he had loved for almost all of that period, was loved by his elder brother, and loved him in return. He flung his right hand above his head and swore a terrible oath that if he might not, his brother should not, rushed out of the house and galloped off among the hills. The orphan was a beautiful girl, tall, pale, and slender, with plentiful dark hair, which, when released from the snood, rippled down below her knees. Her appearance formed a strong contrast with that of her favoured lover, while there was some resemblance between her and the younger brother. In fact, it seemed to his fierce selfishness ground for a prior claim. It may appear strange that a man like him should not have had instant recourse to a superior and hidden knowledge, by means of which he might have gotten rid of his rival with far more certainty and less of risk. But I presume that for the moment his passion overwhelmed his consciousness of skill. Yet I do not suppose that he foresaw the mode in which his hatred was about to operate. At the moment when he learned their mutual attachment, probably through a domestic, the lady was on her way to meet her lover as he returned from the day's sport. The anointed place was on the edge of a deep, rocky ravine. Down in those dark bosom brawling and foamed a little mountain torrent. You know the place, Duncan, my dear, I dare say. Here she gave me a minute description of the spot, with directions how to find it. Whether anyone saw what I am about to relate, or whether it was put together afterwards, I cannot tell. The story is like an old tree, so old that it has probably lost the marks of its growth. But this is how my grandmother told it to me. An evil chance led him to the right direction. The lovers, startled by the sound of the approaching horse, parted in opposite directions along the narrow mountain path on the edge of the ravine. Into this path he struck at a point near where the lovers had met, but to opposite sides of which they now receded, so that he was between them on the path. Turning his horse up the course of the stream, he soon came in sight of his brother on the ledge before him. With a suppressed scream of rage, he rode headlong at him, and, ere he had time to make the least defence, hurled him over the precipice. The helplessness of the strong man was uttered in one single, despairing cry, as he shot into the abyss. Then all was still. The sound of his fall could not reach the edge of the gulf. Divining in a moment that the lady, whose name was Elise, must have fled in the opposite direction, he reined his steed on his haunches. He could touch the precipice with his bridle hand half outstretched. His sword hand half outstretched would probably drop a stone to the bottom of the ravine. There was no room to wheel. One desperate practicality alone remained. Turning his horse's head toward the edge, he compelled him, by means of the powerful bit, to rear till he stood almost erect, and so, his body swaying over the gulf, with quivering and straining muscles to turn on his hind legs. Having completed the half circle, he let him drop and urged him furiously in the opposite direction. It must have been by the devil's own care that he was able to continue his gallop along the ledge of the rock. He soon caught sight of the maiden. She was leaning, half fainting, against the precipice. She had heard her lover's last cry, and although it had conveyed no suggestion of his voice to her ear, she trembled from head to foot, and her limbs would bear her no farther. He checked his speed, rode gently up to her, lifted her unresisting, laid her across the shoulders of his horse, dashed again wildly along the mountainside. The lady's long hair was shaken loose and dropped trailing on the ground. The horse trampled upon it and stumbled, half dragging her from the saddle bow. He caught her, lifted her up, and looked in her face. She was dead. I suppose he went mad. He laid her against the saddle before him and rode on, reckless whether. Horse and man and maiden were found the next day, lying at the foot of a cliff, dashed to pieces. It was observed that a hind shoe of the horse was loose and broken. Whether this had been the cause of his fall could not be told. But ever when he races he will till the day of doom. Along that mountainside his gallop is mingled with the clank of the loose and broken shoe. For, like the sin, the punishment was awful. He shall carry about for ages the phantom body of the girl, knowing that her soul is away, sitting with the soul of his brother, down in the deep ravine, or scaling with him the topmost crags of the towering mountain peaks. There are some who, from time to time, see the doomed man careening along the mountain face, with the lady hanging across the steed, and they say it always betokens a storm, such as this which is now raving about us. I had not noticed till now how absorbed I had been in her tale, that the storm had risen to a very ecstasy of fury. They say likewise that the lady's hair is still growing, for every time they see her it is longer than before, and that now, such is its length and the headlong speed of the horse, that it floats and streams out behind like one of those curved clouds, like a comet's tail, far up in the sky. Only the cloud is white, and the hair dark as night. And they say it will go on growing until the last day, when the horse will falter, and her hair will gather in, and the horse will fall, and the hair will twist and twine and wreathe itself like a mist of threads about him, and blind him to everything but her. Then the body will rise up within face to face with him, animated by a fiend who, twining her arms around him, will drag him down to the bottomless pit. I may mention something which now occurred, and which had a strange effect on my old nurse. It illustrates the assertion that we see around us only what is within us. Marvelous things enough will show themselves to the marvelous mood. During a short lull in the storm, just as she had finished her story, we heard the sound of iron-shod hoofs approaching the cottage. There was no bridle way in the glen. A knock came to the door, and on opening it, we saw an old man seated on a horse, with a long, slenderly veiled sack lying across the saddle before him. He said he had lost the path in the storm, and seeing the light had scrambled down to inquire his way. I perceived at once from the scared and mysterious look of the old woman's eyes that she was persuaded that this appearance had more than a little to do with the awful rider, the terrific storm. and myself who had heard the sound of the phantom hooves. As he ascended the hill, she looked after him with wide and pale but unshrinking eyes, then, turning in, shut and locked the door behind her, as by a natural instinct. After 2 or 3 of her significant nods, accompanied by the compression of her lips, she said, "You need not think to take me in, wizard as he is, with his disguises. I can see through him all, them all. Duncan, my dear, when you suspect anything, do not be too incredulous. This human demon is, of course, a wizard still, and knows how to make himself, as well as anything he touches, take quite a different appearance from the real one. Only every appearance must bear some resemblance, however distant, to the natural form. That man you saw at the door was the phantom of which I have been telling you. What he is after now, of course, I cannot tell, but you must keep a bold heart and a firm and wary foot as you go home tonight." I showed some surprise, I did not doubt, and perhaps some fear as well. But I only said, "How do you know him, Margaret?" "I can hardly tell you," she replied, "but I do know him. I think he hates me. Often, of a wild night, when there is moonlight enough by fits, I see him tearing round his little valley, just on the top edge, all round, the lady's hair, and the horse's mane and tail driving far behind, and mingling, vaporous, with the stormy clouds. About he goes in wild careening gallop, and now as the moon goes in, then, visible far round when she looks out again, an airy, pale grey spectre, which few eyes but mine could see, for, as far as I'm aware, no one in the family but myself has ever possessed the double gift of seeing and hearing both. In this case I hear no sound, except now and then a clank from the broken shoe. But I did not mean to tell you that I had ever seen him. I'm not a bit afraid of him. He cannot do more than he may. His power is limited, else ill enough would he work, the miscreant." "But," I said, "what has all this, terrible as it is, to do with the fright you took at my telling you that I heard the sound of the broken shoe? Surely you're not afraid of only a storm." "No, my boy, I fear no storm, but the fact is that sound is seldom heard, and never, as far as I know, by any of the blood of that wicked man, without betokening some ill to one of the family, and the most probably to the one who hears it. But I'm not quite sure about that. Only some evil it does portend, although a long time may elapse before it shows itself, and I have a hope it may mean someone else than you." "I do not wish that," I replied. "I know no one better able to bear it than I, and I hope, whatever it may be, that I only shall have to meet it. It must surely be something serious to be so foretold. It can hardly be connected with my disappointment at being compelled to be a pedagogue instead of a soldier." "Do not trouble yourself about that, Duncan," replied she. "A soldier you must be. The same day you told me of the clank of the broken horseshoe, I saw you return, wounded from battle, and falling faint from your horse in the street of a great city, only fainting, thank God. But I have particular reason for being uneasy at your hearing that boding sound. Can you tell me the day and the hour of your birth?" "No," I replied. "It seems very odd when I think of it, but I really do not know even the day." anyone else, which is stranger still, she answered. How does that happen, nurse? We were in terrible anxiety about your mother at the time. So ill was she after you were just born, in a strange, unaccountable way, that you lay almost neglected for more than an hour. In the very act of giving birth to you, she seems to the rest around her to be out of her mind. So wildly did she talk. But I knew better. I knew that she was fighting some evil power. And what power it was, I knew full well. For twice during her pains, I heard the click of the horseshoe. But no one could help her. After her delivery, she lay as if in a trance, neither dead nor at rest, but as if frozen to ice, and conscious of all the while. Once more I heard the terrible sound of iron, and at the moment of your mother started from her trance, screaming, "My child, my child!" we suddenly became aware that no one had attended to the child, and rushed to the place where he lay wrapped in a blanket. Uncovering him, we found him black in the face and spotted with dark spots upon the throat. I thought he was dead, but with great and almost helpless pains, we succeeded in making him breathe, and gradually he recovered. But his mother continued dreadfully exhausted. It seemed as if she had spent her life for the child's defiance and birth. That was you, Duncan, my dear. I was in constant attendance upon her about a week after your birth, as near as I can guess. Just in the gloaming, I heard yet the awful clank, only once. Nothing followed until midnight. Your mother slept, and you lay asleep beside her. I sat by the bedside. A horror fell upon me suddenly, though I neither saw nor heard anything. Your mother started from her sleep with a cry, which sounded as if it came from far away, out of a dream, and did not belong to this world. My blood curdled with fear. She sat up in bed and wide-eyed, staring, and half-open, rigid lips, and feeble as she was, thrust her arms straight out before her with great force, her hands open and lifted up with palms outward. The whole action was one violently repelling another. She began to talk wildly as if she had done before you were born, but though I seemed to hear and understand it all at the time, I could not recall a word of it afterwards. It was as if I had listened to it when half asleep. I attempted to soothe her, putting my arms around her, but she seemed quite unconscious of my presence, and my arms seemed powerless upon the fixed muscles of hers. Not that I tried to constrain her, for I knew that a battle was going on of some kind or other, and my interference might do awful mischief. I only tried to comfort and encourage her. All the time I was in a state of indescribable cold and suffering, whether more bodily or mental I could not tell. But at length I heard yet again the clank of the shoe. A sudden peace seemed to fall upon my mind. Or was it a warm, odorous wind that filled the room? Your mother dropped her arms and turned feebly towards her baby. She saw that he slept a blessed sleep. She smiled like a glorified spirit and fell back exhausted on the pillows. I went to the other side of the room to get a cordial. When I returned to the bedside, I saw at once that she was dead. Her face smiled still with an expression of uttermost bliss. Nurse ceased, trembling as overcome by the recollection, and I was too much moved and awed to speak. At length Resuming the conversation, she said, "You see, it's no wonder, Duncan, my dear, if, after all this, I should find, when I wanted to fix the date of your birth, that I could not determine the day or the hour when it took place. All was confusion in my poor brain, but it was strange that no one else could any more than I. One thing only I can tell you about it. As I carried you across the room to lay you down, for I assisted at your birth, I happened to look up to the window. Then I saw what I could not forget, although I did not think of it again till many days after. A bright star was shining on the very tip of the thin crescent moon. Oh, then, I said, it is possible to determine the day and the hour when my birth took place. See the good of book learning, she replied. When you work it out, just let me know, my dear, that I may remember it. That I will. A silence of some moments followed. Margaret resumed. I'm afraid you will laugh at my foolish fancies, Duncan, but in thinking over all these things, as you may suppose I oft do, I lie awake in my lonely bed. The notion sometimes comes to me. What if my Duncan, to be the youth whom this wicked brother hurled into the ravine, come again into a new body, to live out his life, cut short by his brother's hatred? If so, his persecution of you and of your mother for your sake is easy to understand. And if so, you will never be able to rest till you find your fair, wherever she may have been born on the face of the earth. For born she must be long ere now for you to find. I misdoubt me much, however, if you will find her without great conflict and suffering between. For the powers of darkness will be against you, though I have good hope that you will overcome at last. You must forgive the fancies of a foolish old woman, my dear. I will not try to describe the strange feelings, almost sensations that arose in me while listening to these extraordinary utterances. Least should it be, I supposed, I was ready to believe all Margaret narrated or concluded. I could not help doubting her sanity, but no more could I help feeling peculiarly moved by her narrative. Few more words were spoken on either side, but after receiving renewed exhortations to carefulness on the way home, I said goodbye to dear old nurse, considerably comforted, I must confess, that I was not doomed to be a tutor all my days, for I never questioned the truth of that vision and its consequent prophecy. I went out into the mist of the storm, in the altering throbs of blackness and radiance, now the possessor of no more room than what my body filled, and now isolated in world-wide space. And the thunder seemed to follow me, bellowing after me as I went. Absorbed in the story I had heard, I took my way, as I thought, homeward. The whole country was well known to me. I should have said before that night that I could have gone home blindfolded. Whether the lightning bewildered me and made me take a false turn, I cannot say. For the hardest thing to understand in intellectual as well as moral mistakes is how we came to go wrong. But after wandering for some time, plunged in meditation, and with no warning whatsoever of the presence of inimical powers, a brilliant lightning flash showed me that at least I was not near home. The light was prolonged for a second or two by a slight electrical pulsation, and by that I distinguished a wide space of blackness on the ground in front of me. Once more wrapped in the folds of a thick darkness, I dared not move. Suddenly it occurred to me what the blackness was, and whither I had wandered. It was a huge quarry of great depth, long disused and half filled with water. I knew the place perfectly. A few more steps would have carried me over the brink. I stood still, waiting for the next flash, that I might be quite sure of the way I was about to take before I ventured to move. While I stood, I fancied I heard a single, hollow plunge in the black water far below. When the lightning came, I turned and took the path in another direction. After walking for some time across the heath, I fell. The fall became a roll, and down a steep declivity I went, over and over, arriving at the bottom uninjured. Another flash showed me where I was, in the hollow valley, within a couple 100 yards from the nurse's cottage. I made my way towards it. There was no light in it, except the feeblest glow from the embers of her peat fire. She is abed, I said to myself, and I will not disturb her. Yet something drew me towards the little window. I looked in. At first I could see nothing. At length, as I kept gazing, I saw something, indistinct in the darkness, like an outstretched human form. By this time the storm had lulled. The moon had been up for some time, but had been quite concealed by the tempestuous clouds. Now, however, these had begun to break up, and while I stood looking into the cottage, they scattered away from the face of the pale moon, and a pale, vapoury gleam in her light, entering the cottage through a window opposite that which I stood, fell directly on the face of my old nurse, as she lay on her back, outstretched upon chairs, pale as death, with her eyes closed. The light fell nowhere but on her face. A stranger to her habits would have thought that she was dead, but she had so much of the appearance she had had on former occasion that I concluded at once she was in one of her trances. But having often heard that persons in such a condition ought not be disturbed, and feeling quite sure she knew best how to manage herself, I turned, though reluctantly, and left the lone cottage behind me in the night, with the death-like woman lying motionless in the midst of it. I found my way home without any farther difficulty, and went to bed, where I soon fell asleep, thoroughly wearied, more by the mental excitement I had been experiencing than by the amount of bodily exercise I had gone through. My sleep was tormented with awful dreams, yet, strange to say, I awoke in the morning refreshed and fearless. The sun was shining through the chinks in my shutters, which had been closed because of the storm, and was making streaks and bands of golden brilliancy upon the wall. I had dressed and completed my preparations long before I heard the steps of the servant who came to call me. What a wonderful thing waking is! The time of the ghostly moonshine passes by, and the great positive sunlight comes. A man who dreams and knows that he is dreaming thinks he knows what waking is, but knows it so little that he mistakes, one after another, many a vague and dimly change in his dream for a waking. When the true waking comes at last, he is filled and overflowed with the power of its reality. So likewise, one who, in the darkness, lies waiting for the light about to be struck, and trying to conceive, with all the force of his imagination, what the light will be like, is yet, when the reality flames up before him, seized as by a new and unexpected thing, different from and beyond all his imagining. He feels as if darkness were cast to an infinite distance behind him. So shall it be with us we wake from this present. This must be what Novalis means when he says, our life is not a dream, but it may become a dream, and perhaps ought to become one. And so I look back upon the strange history of my past, sometimes asking myself, can it be that all this has really happened to the same me, who am now thinking about it in doubt and wonderment? So quoth this raven.